Hello and welcome to In the Cool of the Day and today's segment of People Connecting People. I'm your host, Ruth Pegeron, and I have a special show for you today. This is part 2 of my series on why do funerals cost so much. So today I'll be connecting you as people to the funeral industry. Funerals are the third largest purchase for most people, and for some, it's the fourth. The other large expenses include homes, cars, and medical expenses. The difference between those expenses and a funeral expense is no one wants to spend $1 on a funeral, let alone $10,000 on a funeral. It is the only thing we must all do and the least common topic to talk about, and certainly not what you want to think about at all. It is much more pleasant and enjoyable to talk about your next home purchase, to talk about your next car purchase. Those purchases are more enjoyable to speak about. Today, I want to share with you some national statistics and give you some insight into the cost of funerals and why do funerals cost so much. While the prices for many goods and services are increasing rapidly, the cost of a funeral is not growing as fast as the rate of inflation. So that's good news. The National Funeral Directors Association is the world's leading and largest funeral service association, serving more than 20,000 individual members who represent nearly 11,000 funeral homes in the United States and 49 countries around the world. The NFDA is the trusted leader. They're the beacon for ethics and the strongest advocate for the profession. We will have a graphic for you to see, but according to the 2021 and actually now 2022 statistics, they haven't changed much from the NFDA, but the general price list study, the median cost of funerals has increased over 6% over the past 5 years to, this is a national average of $7,848. And the median cost of funeral with a cremation has increased significantly, almost in upwards of 13%, anywhere from 11 to 13% over the past 5 years to $6,970. The overall rate of inflation was 13.98% for the same period. So statistics does not have, the National Funeral Director Statistics does not have a specific statistic for Northern Virginia, DC, or Maryland. However, we made on the cost of living in this area, we would guess that we are definitely on the higher end of how much a funeral costs. So what I'm going to go through next in my first session of this, and I guess a couple months ago, we talked a little bit about, I gave you a listing of why funerals cost so much and some of the things that were included in a funeral. But now, today, with session 2, our conversation is going to shift just a little bit to give you a little bit more detail of what the cost includes. So we're going to start with the basic services of a funeral professional and a funeral establishment, which these services must be offered by the regulations from the Federal Trade Commission. And these basic services include the recovery of the loved one from home, hospital, or hospice, and into the funeral home's care at any time of any day, 24-hour operation. And then care for your loved one, minimum care, refrigeration, and then continuous care, which may include embalming, hair and makeup, dressing, placing your beloved in a casket. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that one. And the reason is because to operate 24 hours, a funeral home must have some level of staff. So the staffing includes someone being on call and available for any family member to call 24 hours a day, primarily for when a death has occurred. So the reason that funeral homes have to be accessible 24 hours a day is this is the obvious reason. None of us know the time, the hour, the day, the minute that someone is going to have a passing in their family. And when they do, they need the professionals that are designed to handle that situation which is the funeral home and the funeral directors and funeral assistants and transportation companies. All of those folks are the ones that have to be available. So that adds to the cost of the funeral. That cost of that staffing has to be transferred to the consumer. The other is access to the funeral home's amenities. So there's 3 things in a funeral home that we offer, or we have the opportunity to offer our families. Number 1 is our locations and what's offered in that location. Some funeral homes may have a chapel. Some just have visitation rooms. Some have reception areas, and some have all. Some funeral homes have everything. So this and their amenities would impact the cost of a funeral. So you really have to make a decision of what amenities do you really need to honor your loved one, to celebrate your loved one. And if you need all of those amenities, you want to make sure you pick a funeral home that has all those amenities. But if you don't need all those amenities, you decide which amenities do you use or need to use, and you pick a funeral home based on that. A good example of that would be funeral homes that have chapels. Often they serve families that don't have a church or a church home local, or maybe the church is not available. So they need somewhere to host the funeral for their loved one. So that would be a reason to select one as well. So that makes the funeral cost more. Securing necessary permits and certificates. These things also require time. That adds to the cost of a professional. Your basic printed materials such as funeral program, registry book, use of any mortuary transportation if needed to coordinate all of those items. Coordination of clergy or celebrants. Coordination and placement of funeral flyers and or charity donations. I would like to spend a little bit of time on that one as well. When we talk about coordination of all of those items, inclusive of donations, inclusive of clergy, to organize and to plan a funeral, it's getting everyone there at the same time to execute what the family has desired for their loved one. How do they want it planned? What do they want planned? And it takes coordination between clergy, the funeral home, and I know it says flowers coordination. It's very important to have the flowers arrive to the cemetery well ahead of the loved one being coming there with the family in the procession. So typically the funeral home has to coordinate someone that's going to drive a flower van, is what it is known. All of this coordination takes a lot of time and a lot of people. Again, these add to the cost of the services. Coordination of an online or newspaper obituary. I'm going to spend a minute on that one as well. Most people don't know today that when it comes to online or newspaper obituaries, most of that is done online, and it's not the traditional just Washington Post or just your local newspaper. Now, it is a little bit more coordination as well as a lot of time spent making sure the obituary is right. The cost has also increased significantly for newspaper and obituaries. So now it goes by the number of words that are in the obituary, whether you want a picture, color, or black and white. On which day that you want the obituary to be in the newspaper. In the past, many years ago, it was one flat fee for a black and white obituary and with specific words. Today, there's a lot more flexibility. However, from the old $250 cost, now it can be in the upwards of $1,500, depending on how many words and if you want it color. And the day, if you want it to be ran on a Saturday or a Sunday. All of those things add to the cost of the funeral today. Other costs that are added to the funeral experience that you may want to consider, and that many consider when celebrating the life of themselves or a loved one. Oftentimes, you have a clergy or a funeral celebrant, pastor, priest, or other religious affiliate that will conduct the funeral service, and however, even families who enlist a member of the clergy to lead the service, they may want a celebrant as well, so it could be 2 people to help the family incorporate personal details into every aspect of a memorial. The services of a clergy member and funeral celebrants typically run a few $100s. And as far as clergy, that's considered an honorarium. For limousines, for the procession, and to traditional funerals, that would mean having additional vehicles for the family to be all together behind the hearse. Those are expenses that the families do incur. An alternative location. Today, people are hosting celebration of life services in places that are more fitting of the loved one's loss. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that one as well. And today's celebration of life experiences by families, people are deciding, because of cremation being on a higher end of what it used to be some 20 years ago, where everyone was more of a traditional family, where they did a viewing. Next, they went to the cemetery, a funeral. They had a funeral, then they went to the cemetery. Today, that has changed. So a loved one is also being honored, but not in a traditional way. When cremation entered into the families more and more, the tradition stays the same of a funeral, and it's very important to celebrate the family, the loved one in that family. However, it's not always the traditional way. So more and more families are selecting venues that may be traditionally a wedding venue. American Legions, maybe they were a veteran, VFW post. Maybe they just liked an outdoor location. Maybe they liked golfing, so you're on a golf course. So wherever the loved ones spent their time, or however they felt that they would like to have their celebration of life where people come and honor them, those are now venues which you wouldn't find as a traditional church or a funeral home that have been opened up to do memorial services. Those are expenses that the family has incurred. So they switch often from the church to a different venue. And those are what makes a funeral cost a little bit more. The family I just recently worked with, they chose a location because it was where they got married. And it was a last remembered happy place where their loved one was with them. They wanted a happy place. The event manager at the location said, "We usually do weddings and parties, but the date was open, so we said, why not to have a memorial service?" Some go to restaurants, country clubs, as I said previously, American Legions. You know, this Saturday we're doing one in a family's backyard or other natural outdoor areas. Funerals and memorials now represent the person, and that's what's important more than the money and the cost. Catering. Catering, the repast is food for after a funeral, which is a long-standing tradition for many cultures. As we all know, with food, there is an expense. So that adds to the cost as well. Musicians, whether a single musician, such as a harp player for a chapel, or a bagpiper for graveside, or an entire band for a catered reception, musicians make an impact at a funeral or a memorial. Prices start in the hundreds and can range into the thousands. And I would like to spend a couple minutes on that as well. Recently, I did a service for a gentleman who was born and raised in New Orleans, and they decided to have a band come in, and they were New Orleans based. So that was travel for them. They wanted to make sure that they were a New Orleans band, not someone representing New Orleans. I don't know what the cost of that was, but it didn't matter. But what we are talking about today is what are the things that add to the cost of a funeral? And those are some of the things that do. Caskets and urns. The cost of a traditional casket varies widely. You can pay a few $100s for a cardboard container and use it during cremation, or many thousands for high quality metal or handcrafted wood casket with personal touches. As everyone knows maybe that the wood has been expensive recently, And with that, the wood caskets have caused the price increase. So you may find that if you're experiencing a significant cost in a casket, which you weren't expecting, it could be because of the wood increase in pricing. Cremation urns, they come in many shapes and sizes. Urn prices reflect the size, the material, the design, engraving, if you would like to have your loved one's name and words engraved on the urn, whether they're metal or wood. All of those decisions that a family make do impact the cost. Printed materials, funeral programs, and register books are commonplace. They are the keepsake of the funeral. They are the last memory you have of that loved one. And they're the everlasting memory of that loved one as well. For years to come, people will look back at the program and look back at any stationery bookmarks, any keepsakes that they took from that service. So the family spend a lot of time customizing that so that it becomes something of a keepsake for years to come. It's for people to remember them forever. And to reference back, what did we do on that funeral day? So it becomes a memento as well. So the costing of that and what you decide to do, what a family decides, if it's a color, full color, the size, if it has pictures, all of those things contribute to the cost of a funeral. An obituary. A newspaper may charge to run an obituary, but an online obituary is free. I spoke to that a little bit previously. I didn't reference that an online obituary could be free with your funeral home. So make sure you ask that question if it's that important. A funeral home associate can even help you create one if you don't know how to write one. That would be helpful for you as well. Flowers, another part of a typical funeral cost. They're very important. The kind of flowers and the types of flowers that you use, sizes of arrangements, how many arrangements you want. They make the total price run for a funeral. It can cost several $100s into the thousands for flowers. Again, flowers represent the person. It represents the family's choices, and they do go with funerals. There are some cases where you can get silk flowers. You can ask funeral professionals, or you may know a florist. You don't always have to buy these things right at a funeral home. You're welcome to buy them anywhere you want. That's going to be most cost effective for you. But funeral and flowers, they go hand in hand, and they're very important to a funeral and to family. Flowers are very comforting. There are other funeral keepsakes. People do movies, slideshows, portraits, blankets. They do mini cremation urns so that everybody can have a little bit of their loved one's cremated remains. And they make more heartfelt keepsakes for family members. Funeral favors such as personalized golf balls, key rings, or boxes of cookies made from a special recipe are a modern day way to celebrate life. Jewelry, cremation jewelry, and other charms of remembrance are lasting ways to keep the memory of a loved one near. They can also be passed down for generations. These types of keepsakes can also be added to the funeral bill, but they can be inexpensive, but they can still add to the cost. Again, depending on your choice. After the break, we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit about cemetery costs. So it's time for a break. I will return after these few messages.
Taking care of a family member can lead to plenty of questions. Fortunately, there's a place to get the answers, for them and for you. Find articles, tips, and tools from experts and others who have been in your place. The Caregiving Resource Center at aarp.org/caregiving.
Welcome back. You're watching In the Cool of the Day in today's segment of People Connecting People, where I have been connecting you to the funeral industry. Prior to the break, I was discussing our series on part 2 of why do funerals cost so much? And I wanted to, I said I would talk a little bit about cemetery costs. So today, funeral cost is one part of the funeral, which we've been talking about. And then there's part two, which is the cemetery cost. So whether you're cremated or buried full body, you still could have a cemetery expense. There are many people that get cremated and still go to a cemetery. That's a myth that if you're cremated, a cemetery is not a part of the funeral experience. And there's still the traditional, which is the full body burial. But because cremation has spiked a bit, that means that burials have decreased and the cost for cemeteries have gone up in some form or fashion. So if you're interested in going to a cemetery and being buried, whether your cremated remains will be buried or your full body, your whole family will be there, there's no time better than today to plan. Planning for a funeral is very important. So you can pre-plan a funeral by going to a funeral home and pre-planning and going to a cemetery and starting to pay for your funeral expenses and your cemetery expenses well ahead of you passing. And that will help in today's cost. So it's very important that you do that because the cost is going up more and more. As I mentioned in our opening, no one wants to talk about funeral expenses. No one wants to talk about death, and especially their own. But if you look at it from not just the human side, if you take a moment and just think about the business side, then you would want to know what is going to be the expense for my family or whoever's responsible for me. And maybe that'll encourage you or inspire you to want to leave the greatest gift of love, which is having your funeral and your cremation, your burial, your cemetery, your headstone plans well ahead of time. A lifetime is filled with many experiences, lots of special relationships with family and friends included too. They're very important people. Are often our education and career successes, all in which a funeral captures for those left behind. So you can have a very accomplished life. You could have lived extremely well, and your family would like you to be buried or end equally as well. But they would need your help to do that. So planning is very important. In today's culture, we're moving fast, everything is going fast, everything's a fast pace. Slow down, take a minute to really value yourself and your loved ones and think about them. There's one question I often ask people: if something was to have happened to you yesterday, the person that's responsible for you, the person that you love the most, that will be sitting in front of a professional like myself, what would they do? Would you have it all planned for them? Or would they have to figure out what you would want? So although talking about your own funeral or dying, all those things aren't comfortable, but if you think about it being the greatest gift of love, the greatest thing you can do for someone, I hope that would inspire you to meet with a funeral professional, a cemetery professional, or at least start having the conversation. It's not always about planning to buy it today, even if you don't want to purchase it today and preserve today's cost. But at least tell your family, plan it out so that they don't know what to pay for when the event does occur. Doesn't matter how old you are at all, young or old, everyone should do this. There's a lot of value in a funeral professional being able to help coordinate all these parts while comforting a family who has experienced one of the most worst times of their lives. In fact, when it's done well and right, with attention to detail and a manner that seems effortless, the goal of the funeral professionals every day is to do what the family wants, to remember their loved one on their way. It's not for the funeral homes to guess how the loved one lived. It's not for the funeral professional to say what you should do, but it is for them to hear the life and to help you come up with a plan that's going to be well remembered. A funeral professional's goal every day is to say, did I help that family with all the choices. We operate in a space every day they don't, with all the choices they have to remember their loved one. When it's planned, the funeral professional gets to say, wow, they really loved you. They planned everything. They picked their casket. They picked their cemetery. They picked whether they want cremation. They picked whether they want burial. They picked the clothing they wanted to have. They picked where they wanted to be. Oftentimes people want to go back home where they were born. Did you tell your loved one that? So they can execute it. That is what the ultimate goal is to honor your life the way you would honor it if you were able to do it yourself, if you didn't. Well, it's that time again. If you have any questions about today's segment, please see the information scrolling below. You have been watching In the Cool of the Day and today's segment of People Connecting People. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week. Until next time on People Connecting People.